Well, hello and welcome to our talk, fair crowd. Hi there. We can be intimate. My name is Nato Thompson. I'm Chief Curator at Creative Time. And I'm here with Sofia Hernandez. No, I'm joking. Sofia's actually right there, but apparently due to some shocking amounts, no, I don't know why it is, but she lost her voice last night. And so you can hear her whisper to you over there if you need questions with her. But in the kind of maneuver of deft strategy, we have Jorge Munguia from Passos Debt, who will be talking about the cultural scene in Mexico City, as well as Joerg Koch from 032C. And both of these groups are participating in the Oceanfront project that Creative Time has partnered with Art Basel Miami on. That's on the Oceanfront. Have you guys all been out there? Do you know about this? You do? Can you raise your hand if you've been there? All right, cool. Well, so tonight, every night, we have a different city. There's 4 cities that are being highlighted. The first was Detroit. The second was Mexico City. Tonight is Berlin. And tomorrow is Glasgow. And these cities were chosen based on their, rough, it's hard to say Berlin's on the periphery, but in terms of kind of a periphery to kind of central art markets, considering this is an art fair, and spaces of cultural production with their distinct historical and geopolitical histories. And I think the thing that people here might want to hear about most is just to get a brief texture of what it's like in the cities and the things that these gentlemen find of particular interest. So first, I'd just like to turn it over to them to talk briefly about what they do and their kind of role of cultural production in the specific city. So first, let's go with you, Jorge Munguia.
As Nate was saying, I'm from Passos Debt, which is a non-profit organization in Mexico City that we're very interested in serving as a channel for content that comes from all of the people who are specializing in very specific areas that are involved within the city, like, for example, education, health, sustainability, culture, and how do we move this content into a broader audience that will be able to consume it and hopefully feed this audience into becoming much more critical about the development or direction the city is taking, and also trying to have I could say maybe a greater footprint on people who are decision making, and actually trying to empower people to become their own developers and decision makings within changing the city. And in this non-profit, one of our main lines of work is having a grant that we hope to give annually, that we try to search for the projects that are most relevant in trying to change the quality of life within the city. And to these projects that we select, we give an important financial aid to try to help them move on. But also that comes along with a program of 10 weeks of talks and workshops with specialists in different areas that are not their own, hoping that by the end of the program, they meet we make a dinner with different investment funds, and we hope that after that dinner, they all take off. And that's been pretty good, because it's actually not being part of a government or a public institution or a private corporation that is trying to empower individuals into changing their environment.
Joerg, do you want to take a stab at it too? What is 032C?
My name is Joerg. I'm the editor and co-founder of O32C magazine, which is, I would say, quite a quintessential Berlin product. Right now, it's like a biannual contemporary culture magazine, and we also have an exhibition space, a vitrine 8 meters long, designed by Konstantin Gricic, where we stage exhibitions on archives, whether it's from Chris Durkin, the director of Haus der Kunst, or fashion designer Helmut Lang, or now next month Jürgen Teller. So the scope of a magazine is quite broad. It's politics, architecture, fashion, but predominantly the two engines for visual culture these days, fashion and art. And it all started quite innocently in Berlin. I came to Berlin in the mid-90s, so I already missed the first wave of activities after the wall came down, when people were virtually getting into buildings and starting their own projects and opening up their bars. And I got the aftermath of everything, when like architects were having like a bar, or then artists were actually building bars. And all this was very defining for us in the mid-90s, because there was like this incredible feeling of possibility. And you also had like still the city was rebuilt, and obviously the architecture is not as exciting as the vacancy back then, because it was quite utopian. And that spirit was very defining for the magazine. And I think tonight at Oceanfront, it's really about this. It's about the collaborative spirit there, about people coming together from different disciplines and doing something together. And this has become like the modus operandi of the creative industries and of art these days. But I still believe that this is quite a phenomenon specific to Berlin.
When we were back talking about trying to find similarities between Mexico City and Berlin, Sophia said, you know, as you talk, things will just emerge. And already one of the things that I think is, we're already just briefly discussing that maybe you could just kind of dive into is, you know, I know the word interdisciplinary can be kind of annoying because it almost seems too simplistic for what's happening. But it seems to me, it certainly is indicative of both of your practices, if you will. Maybe you could talk, and I also would hope you can talk about how this is informed by the other works that will be have been on show at the Oceanfront as well. But maybe you could just talk about what is this interdisciplinary practice that's incorporating visual culture, fashion, architecture, philosophy, all of this into a kind of methodology.
Yeah, like in the case of Passos Debt, we see it, I mean, we organize a series of thematic events every now and then, and what we do is like try to approach a subject within the national agenda, like what is sustainability, or what is it that we should be thinking on education. And exactly what we've found most interesting is that having within the speakers a very good mix of like public people working for the government, or like people within corporations, but also people from the academia, and like artists and or like product designers, makes it a very interesting scope. Because of the nature of the forums, like every speaker has to speak 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and that's like
you
what
organize
happened
these
yesterday.
kind of Pechacucha events,
Yes,
right?
actually. So we organized the Pechacucha events, and then that kind of evolved into the Passos Debt. So just having like the subject of what is it that we should be thinking on education, but not only having education specialists in the traditional sense, but having in an hour and a half 10 speakers that come from, let's say, the arts, and a philosopher, and the Minister of Education, and maybe someone within a company. By the end of the night, you have a very interesting scope of what should I be thinking, or like the normal view of a subject completely shifts just by having that interdisciplinary approach. And I think it is very nutritious in terms of project development and like agency.
Certainly we saw that with, I mean, all the works that were kind of presented predominantly were very interdisciplinary in that way, but I'm thinking of Toro Lab, for example. Raul Cadenius' project is certainly of that ilk, and Pedro Reyes' work is very So, I mean, can you name some other artists that you think in this region are doing interesting work?
Well, definitely Tercero Un Quinto, which is an art collective from Monterrey, I think. They work very interestingly with space and how we approach space and negotiate like public space with private space, and private space against private space. And what is very interesting about them is that it's not only about the intervention in space, it's also about exhibiting the whole process. So that allows you, like everyone, like in the audience, to kind of understand the discussions behind it. And I think that's very interesting. There's also a lot of initiatives right now that try to incorporate art within the public sphere in a way that it's not only just an object, but actually more like a introduction to a discussion happening in open space. One that has been talked about a lot is a botanical park in northern Mexico, in Culiacan, that is engaging a lot of artists into trying to make this botanical park a relevant point for the city, as not only referring to itself, but also to the context, like Teresa Margoles' works referring to political issues, but taking a very political and drug dealing issues like happening, but having a very strong presence within the field. I think like there's a lot of things going on in Mexico. Those are just to name a few.
Joerg, can you name a few things that you think of our interest or demonstrate a kind of interdisciplinary practice?
While we are interested in it. I mean, like, the short answer, and on a micro level, why the magazine is interested in that, is that there is like a promiscuous curiosity at hand within the magazine. And on a bigger scale within Berlin, and I would speculate here, it probably, because like that whole interdisciplinary thing is like really like sometimes quite artificial, you know, it's like you can't hear it anymore. And I think in Berlin, it might be really quite natural because the city is completely bankrupt. That's why it's such a magnet for artists to move their studios to Berlin, because there is so much cheap. It's the living standard is quite high, but very affordable, and that makes it interesting because urbanism plays a big role because also of all the political things happened in the city. You know, it's like a Bunsen burner beneath it, and it heats everything up. So you can't really avoid not being interested in politics, in architecture, or in art, in whatever discipline you are.
And do you think the artists that are presenting like this evening, maybe you could just tell us briefly about who's coming up this night so these folks can go check it out?
Well, as I said earlier, the idea was really to have like this more like not necessarily works that are about Berlin, but more about practices that emerge or are generated by the city. So it's not like really like a canonical set of artists, you know, but rather it's like a snapshot, you know, it's like really like an interview of different levels of people. And so it's like an architect, like Arno Brandlhuber, who did like one of the most amazing new buildings in Berlin because it completely fucked with the conservative Berlin building regulations. And he works there tonight with Isa Melsheimer, an artist, and they talk about the brutalism and collapse and concrete that really defined the Berlin landscape. But then you also have like two young American artists called H3D, who would do like this really high energy avatar motion tracking DJ sets, you know? And, but obviously there are like nowadays around 500 galleries in Berlin. And it's also very important to note that like a lot of emergence of Berlin as an art capital was done by galleries and not by the institutions. And so you have a lot of artists working there, and of course the big guys like Olafur Eliasson or Thomas Demand or Henri Salar, or, you know, the list could go on. And everyone, each of its own, does really interesting things. You know, Olafur has just started a research institute, and that's also quite interesting, you know.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, it's basically like a mixture between Olafur's laboratory and like a state-funded university about space tactics, about research in space.
You know, I think about here we are at Art Basel Miami's big space. You got booth. It's a booth universe. And, this is the place where a lot of the economic support for the gallery system functions. But a lot of the work we're talking about that you particularly your practices, certainly aren't emblematic of the work here. And it's interesting to me about how does one produce a space where people can get access to this? Because for a large general audience, this is emblematic of the totality of aesthetic production. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So do you have, these are great opportunities to show that there's much more complex social kind of interdisciplinary practices that are happening out there. And I find them to be the most compelling kind of work. So I'm wondering, maybe in terms of your specific cities, what are venues where people could get access to this? Where they can get kind of to this kind of not necessarily discrete object kind of based production?
Well, in the case of Mexico, I think media is playing a very important role just because of how like internet and like other different platforms are trying to go outside of institutions or like other venues, like for example a lot of artists taking into music, or like suddenly the institution or like an art fair is part of the universe, but it's not the totality, as you say. And in a way, like before it seemed that the institution was like a referential stone, and I think now because of the role that people relate to media and like the content, like they're trying to find ways outside of that. So suddenly the institutions are not the only reference point. And people are, I feel, much more interested in like process and like trying to have a closer understanding of cultural production. And in this sense, I think more than like alternative spaces that are also happening. It's just like having a different approach to content and the process of making, and they're more, I feel there's a larger curiosity of like, how does this come to life? Like, what are the story behind it? Like, what is the process to make it happen? And
it's interesting. At Creative Time, we've been organizing this Creative Time Summit, which is kind of like a Pechacucha style event in a sense. But it's interesting because it's increasingly we're trying to just get it out of the visual arts categories and make it much more kind of robust. But then you have people saying, oh, you're just like TED. You guys are familiar with TED, the TED conference, which comes out of a whole other world, right? But then you find that online it kind of lives in a similar kind of mental, like you're saying, like an other reference point for mass culture that is this kind of discursive environment. And it is a kind of different landscape of references that I'm sure your magazine kind of reads off of too, because certainly in publications, this kind of way of working is not particularly new in a sense, right?
Yeah, I think what has happened, like we exist for 10 years now, and it started out of a project space as a limited edition newspaper thing, and it's now something like Vanity Fair on crack, like with advertisements, lots of advertisements.
Is that the masthead?
Yeah. But the thing is like that I would say that the mainstream has become so much more intelligent in recent years, and the interest in other practices beyond those established channels is huge.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic.
It's actually totally inspiring.
Yeah.
Because people think everyone's getting dumber, but I find you look at these.
Oh, no cultural pessimism.
Yeah.
No, and I would even add the audience is becoming interdisciplinary in their needs of media. So you're not you just don't necessarily only want the art approach to art or to the city. You want it to complement with other different branches of knowledge and culture and political affairs and a little bit like what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I think that's also interesting. Not only the artists, but also the audience.
You know this phrase, the prosumer? It's the idea that, there's a consumer and there's a producer, but increasingly on neoliberal capital, the producer is the consumer, that it's the idea that everyone's an artist, but it's under a kind of capitalist guise. But I kind of think it's a very interesting idea for online audiences who kind of participate in the production of knowledge as well as ingesting it You know, it's super interesting in terms of the work both of you guys are doing.
And I think that also has like an impact in how also institutions are taking an approach to their own programs. For example, I think that in the case of Dotamaggio, it's done a very good job in trying to have many different fronts to only to addressing contemporary culture. And the question is, what is contemporary culture, and who are the people behind trying to produce this culture, rather than just like what is relevant in art today within this context. So suddenly you find that the program has discussions of political affairs, or like having a music program with artists that are based with a visual practice, or like artists taking on music or with a visual practice. So I think that's also very interesting, how, as you were saying, like the consumer's needs are also like having an effect in institutions or in other structures.
Let me just switch gears for a second. Is Berlin still a city? You know, the story was in Berlin, like, this is the place where artists just go to live, right? It's affordable. There's lots of artists that live there, but it's not necessarily where they go to show, right? Is that still, I mean, that was certainly the kind of case 10 years ago. What is the case now? Is it still, do you feel this kind of influx of artists coming in? Is it feeling saturated?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, it's incredible, like, especially from America, like American college kids moving to Berlin. Sorry?
I'm sorry about that.
No.
coming.
It's fantastic,
Okay.
because it's fantastic because it adds more dynamics to the city, and because, as I said earlier, the city is bankrupt, so there are not like many jobs out there. It's probably like the only capital in the world where the rest of a country does better than the actual capital, you know. So when you move into the city, you have to create your own structure. You have to create something. Because there are not like super huge galleries existing with like a staff of 20, 30 people. So those kids who move into this city can easily start their own space or start their own studio very quickly. And I think that's like the enduring appeal of Berlin, is that there is simply no establishment existing, because there was like always disruption through the systems, that there was no continuity over like decades of like an establishment to evolve. So the city in itself is very open. I mean, like, if you want to move to Berlin, within 4 weeks, if you go out on a regular base, you could be like completely integrated in the social fabric of a city.
And just about what you were saying, I think it's very interesting. You were talking about like people coming and having like a very interesting, I mean, like a very accessible way to start their own space or studio. But my impression of Berlin is also that they start like offices, and offices have like this mix of like storefronts, like gathering spaces. And the idea of an office, I think, it's gaining much more relevance within cultural production now. Like an artist having an office rather than a studio, or like creative people coming together and like putting on an office rather than just a gallery. It's not about exhibiting, it's about making. And many of these times, whatever they make goes beyond like an object or a confined space or just exhibition. It's also a lot about like I don't know, like kind of allowing more a larger participation from others that go elsewhere, like beyond themselves.
Certainly in New York City, Eflux, which I know, Anton and Julieta all worked in Berlin for quite some time, but their space operates as a kind of hybrid model of meeting space, office, exhibition venue, publication, research, whatever. But it's actually, I find this show totally interesting.
Oh yeah, you can see that the model of certain phenomena are then exported to other cities, Yeah.
In terms of Mexico City, it's a huge city. It's so vastly different than Berlin. What is it like for artists either coming up out of Mexico or people coming in? How is it different than Berlin in that sense? I mean, do people just start up spaces? Is it?
No, not with that like activity. But I think that the energy within Mexico it has shown very interesting cases in which galleries start not necessarily as a space but as an event, or suddenly I think because of the conditions of Mexico, it's also much more easier to find means and ways to solve everything with much smaller budget than any other capital in the world. So, for example, in the case of Passos Debt, I know it would have not been possible trying to do this in a large capital just because of I don't know, the production it would need to take. So that informality has that permeates all throughout the city has also allowed everyone to find different ways to move around, so suddenly having sporadic spaces that go and disappear, or having galleries that start having a library section, or there's people are very interested in trying to find the means to make it, which are not traditional. So it's always about negotiations, constant negotiations, and how can I find this, and where do we get this and that, and making it happen. And in the case of one project we're working on, it's even allowed us to collaborate with the government, just because the government also was very allowing for that informality. It was a project of making interviews with mayors from the world coming to a summit in Mexico City. It was over 1,500 mayors, and we, in this interest to making these interviews, we approached the city, and they were yes, why don't you just become the representation of the city, as a discussion forum. And this is a project done with Pedro Reyes that presented yesterday, Joseph Grima from Domus Milan, and Passos Debt. And it was very interesting just that the government itself allowed for that. Other people were saying really? How did you make this happen? In my country, the government would have never allowed such things. So I think in that way it has allowed
I want to take some questions from the audience. Do people have some questions for our folks up here? We got some microphones.
I have one.
You got a mic.
Yeah, you have mentioned the education 2 times or 3, and also audience. I wonder, for how do you recruit your audience? Just a bunch of artists educate themselves, or general public, including families and children? And
no, we're addressing a general audience. We're oral or initiatives are not focused only to the art producing.
But how do you
world.
get them? What are your techniques of getting them? I guess.
So a lot of our strategies go into internet, social media, different strategies. It has to do a lot with how we place content within a context that it's relevant. So we found that one of the key things was asking, for example, everyone we invite to synthesize this format has been very helpful, because everyone, no matter how knowledgeable they are, they have to sum it all into 6 minutes and 40 seconds. So at 6 minutes and 40 seconds, suddenly it translates, rather than a very complex, cryptic, academic language, into a very broad and massive message that has to trigger the main message in a few minutes. So the format has been very important for us, and all of the tools of social media, publications, radio programs, columns at national newspapers, working a lot with communications. So that's been what.
A question over here. Thanks. Runner.
This is sort of complex. I spent a lot of the year in Mérida, in the state of the Yucatan. We just had a fabulous Rufino Tamayo exhibit come there. And I'm just wondering if you have any initiatives for the, there's a large cultural community, a large artistic community in the Yucatan?
Well, right now we are only a 2-year-old organization, but right now we are working on going outside Mexico City, and because of circumstance and planning, we're working a lot our interest into the northern part of Mexico. So we're working on doing some things in Ciudad Juarez and Monterrey, and like, but hopefully, yes, like our idea is like find a way to replicate this into a larger scale.
This is not just the visual arts, is it? It also includes performing arts?
Yeah, and includes all of the disciplines, like includes even, as we were talking a little bit now, like historians and like even companies that are approaching culture or public life in a different way, or organizations and philosophers, architects, designers, cooks even, and like everyone's invited. It's a very inclusive forum.
It's a very exciting time to be in Mexico because you see this everywhere. It's blossoming. Not to leave Berlin out of this, for I just don't have any connection. And between the arts of the indigenous people being incorporated into the contemporary arts, it's really an excellent time to see the melding of politics and history and culture coming together to create something new. So I'm very impressed. I'd love more information.
Great, thanks so much. We got any other questions out there? Well, I think we're out of time, so it's okay. I want to thank our panelists and thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.